My name is Beverly, and I'm 28 years old. Right now, I'm sitting in the living room of my beautiful three-bedroom colonial home, but the journey to get here nearly destroyed my relationship with my family forever. You see, my own parents actually took me to court because I bought this house with my own money. They demanded I hand it over to my unemployed sister Marlene, claiming I had somehow stolen what rightfully belonged to her. I've been working since I was 15 years old, never asked them for a single dime, and even paid off my own college education through 3 jobs and student loans. But apparently achieving the American dream through hard work and determination was somehow a crime in my family's eyes. Before I tell you this unbelievable story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Please hit that like button and subscribe, because trust me, you won't believe what my own family put me through just because I dared to succeed on my own. Growing up in suburban Ohio, I learned early that there were 2 different sets of rules in our household. One set applied to me, and a completely different, much more lenient set applied to my younger sister Marlene. I was the responsible one, the one who never caused trouble, who always did her homework without being asked, who helped with chores without complaining. Marlene, on the other hand, was the golden child who could do no wrong even when she was clearly doing everything wrong. When I turned 15, I knew I wanted more from life than what I saw around me. Our family wasn't poor, but we weren't wealthy either. My dad worked at the local manufacturing plant, and my mom was a part-time secretary at a dentist's office. They made enough to get by, but there was always this underlying tension about money, always discussions about what we could and couldn't afford. I decided then that I would never be in that position. I would never have to worry about whether I could afford something I needed or wanted. So I got my first job at Martha's Diner on Main Street, washing dishes and bussing tables after school and on weekends. The work was hard, my hands were always wrinkled from the hot, soapy water, and I smelled like grease and coffee by the end of every shift. But I loved that first paycheck. It was only $87 after taxes, but it was mine. I had earned it with my own 2 hands, and nobody could take that away from me. Meanwhile, Marlene spent her afternoons watching television and complaining about how boring her life was. When she turned 16, my parents surprised her with a used Honda Civic for her birthday. I remember standing in the driveway, genuinely happy for her, but also wondering why the rules were so different for us. When I had turned 16 2 years earlier, there was no car, no surprise, no celebration beyond a small cake after dinner. I didn't complain, though. Instead, I saved every penny I could from my job at the diner. By the time I turned 18, I had enough to buy my own car, a reliable but older Toyota Corolla that got me through the rest of high school and my first 2 years of college. I was proud of that car because it represented something my sister's Honda never could complete: independence and self-reliance. College was where the differences between Marlene and me became even more pronounced. My parents sat me down during my senior year of high school and explained that while they wanted to help with college, they just didn't have the money to pay for both of us. Since Marlene was younger and needed more guidance, they had decided to save what they could for her education. I would need to figure out my own path. I wasn't angry about this decision, at least not at first. It seemed logical, and I had always been the one who figured things out for herself anyway. So I applied for every scholarship I could find, took out student loans, and worked 3 different jobs to pay for my business degree at the local state university. I worked at the diner on weekends, tutored struggling students in math and English, and had a work-study job in the university's admissions office during the week. Those 4 years were exhausting, but they were also transformative. While other students were partying and sleeping in, I was building character, learning the value of hard work, and developing skills that would serve me well in my career. I graduated with a 3.8 GPA and only $23,000 in student loan debt, which I considered a victory given that most of my classmates owed twice that amount. Marlene, on the other hand, coasted through high school with mediocre grades and then enrolled at the same university with full parental financial support. She changed her major 4 times, failed several classes, and took 6 years to graduate with a degree in communications and no clear career goals. But every semester, my parents faithfully paid her tuition, bought her textbooks, and even gave her spending money for social activities. After graduation, I landed my first real job in marketing at a mid-sized company downtown. The salary wasn't amazing, yet it was steady and it came with benefits and opportunities for advancement. I moved into a small but clean apartment, continued driving my reliable Toyota, and started the slow process of paying off my student loans while building my career. This was also when my parents began their campaign of financial manipulation disguised as family loyalty. At least once a month, usually during our Sunday family dinners, they would bring up Marlene's struggles with finding employment or keeping a job. She would go through periods of unemployment, sometimes lasting several months, and during these times, my parents would ask if I could help her out with her rent or her car payment, or just some general financial support to get her back on her feet. I helped when I could, but I also set boundaries. I was still paying off my own student loans, trying to build an emergency fund and planning for my future. I couldn't afford to become Marlene's permanent financial safety net, especially when it became clear that she wasn't making any real effort to improve her situation. She would take temporary jobs and quit after a few weeks, claiming the work was beneath her or that her boss was unreasonable. She moved from apartment to apartment, always finding reasons why each place wasn't suitable for her needs. The constant requests for help, combined with the subtle guilt trips when I couldn't or wouldn't provide it, began to wear on me. I started to see a pattern that I hadn't noticed as clearly when we were younger. In my parents' eyes, my success was viewed not as something to be proud of, but as a resource to be shared with Marlene. My hard work, my sacrifices, my careful planning, all of it was somehow seen as a family asset rather than personal achievement. By the time I turned 26, I had been promoted twice at my marketing job and was earning a solid middle-class salary. I had paid off my student loans, completely built up a substantial emergency fund, and started seriously researching the process of buying my first home. This wasn't just a financial goal. It was deeply emotional for me. Owning my own home represented the ultimate symbol of independence and stability that I had been working toward since I was 15 years old. I spent months learning everything I could about the home buying process. I researched different neighborhoods, studied market trends, learned about interest rates and loan types, and carefully calculated what I could afford based on my income and savings. I wanted to make sure I was making a smart financial decision, not just an emotional one. The house hunting process was both exciting and exhausting. Every weekend for 3 months, I would spend hours driving through different neighborhoods, attending open houses, and meeting with real estate agents. I looked at condos, townhouses, and single-family homes. I saw places that were move-in ready, and others that needed significant work. Some were in my price range but in questionable neighborhoods, while others were in perfect locations, but stretched my budget beyond what I was comfortable with. I developed a system for evaluating each property, taking detailed notes about the condition of the house, the neighborhood, the school district, and the potential for future value appreciation. I wasn't just buying a place to live. I was making an investment in my future, and I wanted to make sure it was the right choice. Then I found it. The house was a charming 3-bedroom colonial built in the 1940s in a well-established neighborhood about 15 miles from downtown. It had original hardwood floors that had been beautifully maintained, an updated kitchen with granite countertops, and a large backyard with mature trees that provided plenty of shade. The house had been well cared for by an elderly couple who were downsizing to a retirement community. The asking price was $185,000, which was right at the top of my budget but still manageable. I had saved $40,000 for a down payment, which was more than the required 20%, and I had been pre-approved for a mortgage at a very reasonable interest rate. My debt-to-income ratio was excellent, my credit score was in the high 700s, and I had a stable employment history that made me an attractive borrower. I put in an offer the same day I saw the house, and after some minor negotiations, we settled on a final price of $178,000. The inspection revealed only minor issues that the sellers agreed to address before closing, And within 6 weeks, I was sitting at a conference table signing what felt like hundreds of documents to finalize the purchase of my first home. The moment I received the keys was one of the most emotional of my life. Standing in the empty living room of my house, I felt a sense of accomplishment and pride that was unlike anything I had ever experienced. This wasn't just shelter. This was proof that all the hard work, all the sacrifices, all the careful planning had been worth it. I had achieved something significant entirely on my own without anyone's help or financial support. I spent the next few weeks moving in and slowly decorating each room. I bought furniture piece by piece, carefully choosing items that reflected my personal style and fit within my budget. I painted the guest bedroom a soft blue-hung artwork that I had been collecting for years and planted flowers in the front garden. Every corner of the house felt like an extension of myself, a physical manifestation of everything I had worked to achieve. When I invited my family over for dinner to see the house for the first time, their reaction was mixed. My parents seemed genuinely impressed with what I had accomplished, complimenting the house and acknowledging how hard I had worked to make it happen. Marlene, who was going through another period of unemployment at the time, was quieter than usual. She walked through each room making polite comments about the decor and the layout, but I could sense something underneath her words that I couldn't quite identify at the time. Looking back now, I realized that was the moment when everything began to change. Seeing my house, seeing what I had accomplished independently, seemed to trigger something in both Marlene and my parents. It was as if my success had somehow upset a balance in our family dynamic that I hadn't even realized existed. For years, I had been the responsible one who helped when she could, and Marlene had been the one who needed help. But now I had something substantial, something permanent, something that clearly demonstrated the difference between our life choices and their consequences. The first few months in my new house were blissful. I settled into a comfortable routine of work-home improvement projects and quiet evenings in my own space. I was dating someone casually, had a solid group of friends, and felt more content with my life than I ever had before. But underneath this surface calm, tensions were building in my family that I was only beginning to understand. Marlene's situation had gotten progressively worse over the past year. She had been fired from her last job at a retail store for chronic tardiness and what her manager described as a poor attitude toward customers. She was having trouble finding new employment, partly because of her inconsistent work history and partly because she had developed a reputation in our small community for being unreliable. Her unemployment benefits had run out, and she was struggling to pay rent on her studio apartment. My parents had been supplementing her income for months, but their own financial situation was becoming strained. My dad was nearing retirement, and they were trying to save money for their own future, while supporting a 26-year-old daughter who seemed unable or unwilling to support herself. The stress was affecting their marriage, and I could see the toll it was taking on both of them during our family dinners. It was during one of these Sunday dinners that my parents first brought up the idea of Marlene moving in with me. They approached it casually, almost as a joke, at first mentioning how nice it would be if Marlene could stay in my guest room just until she got back on her feet. They talked about how it would be good for both of us, how Marlene could help with household chores, and I could provide the stability and structure she needed to find a new job. I politely but firmly declined. I explained that I had worked very hard to achieve my independence and that living alone was important to me at this stage of my life. I offered to help Marlene in other ways, perhaps by reviewing her resume or practicing interview skills with her, but I made it clear that having her live in my house was not an option I was willing to consider. My parents seemed to accept this decision initially, but over the following weeks they began to bring it up again with increasing frequency and intensity. They started using phrases like family loyalty and helping those who need it most. They reminded me of times when they had helped me, conveniently forgetting that most of my achievements had been accomplished without their financial support. They suggested that I was being selfish by keeping such a large house to myself when my sister was struggling. The conversations became more uncomfortable each time, and I began to dread our family dinners. What had once been pleasant social gatherings became sessions of guilt and manipulation, with my parents working together to wear down my resistance to their plan. They would start subtly mentioning Marlene's latest job search disappointment or her financial stress, and then gradually increase the pressure until they were directly asking me to reconsider letting her move in. Marlene herself began to change during this period. She became more vocal about her opinions regarding my house, making comments about how much space I had and how it seemed wasteful for one person to live in such a large place. She would walk through my house during family visits, commenting on how the guest room was just sitting empty, how the second bathroom was unnecessary for just me, how the large kitchen was wasted on someone who ate most of her meals alone. These comments were always made in a light, joking tone, but there was an underlying edge to them that made me increasingly uncomfortable. It was as if Marlene was conducting an inventory of my home, cataloging all the ways it was being underutilized by someone who didn't deserve it as much as she did. The manipulation tactics escalated when my parents began involving other family members in their campaign. During a family barbecue at my aunt's house, several relatives made comments about how generous it would be if I could help Marlene during her difficult time. They praised other family members who had taken in struggling relatives, creating obvious comparisons to my refusal to do the same. I realized that my parents had been talking to the extended family about our situation, presenting it in a way that made me appear selfish and uncaring. The final straw came when my parents threatened to exclude me from family events if I continued to refuse their requests. They suggested that maybe I didn't value family relationships as much as they thought I did, and that perhaps it would be better if I didn't attend family gatherings until I was ready to be more supportive of my sister's needs. This threat revealed the true nature of what was happening. This wasn't about helping Marlene find temporary housing. This was about my parents' inability to accept that I had succeeded where their preferred daughter had failed. My success was an inconvenient reminder of Marlene's failures, and rather than addressing the real problem, they wanted to redistribute the benefits of my hard work to make themselves feel better about the situation. I stood my ground, but the stress of the constant conflict was affecting every aspect of my life. I was losing sleep, having trouble concentrating at work, and feeling anxious about every interaction with my family. The house that had been my sanctuary was becoming a source of guilt and tension, and I began to question whether owning it was worth the destruction of my family relationships. Then came a few weeks of unusual quiet. My parents stopped bringing up the topic of Marlene moving in with me, and our family dinners returned to something approaching normal conversation. I thought perhaps they had finally accepted my decision and moved on to other solutions for Marlene's housing situation. I was wrong. They were planning something much worse than continued emotional manipulation. The first sign that something serious was happening came on a Tuesday morning in late October. I was getting ready for work when I heard a knock at my front door. It was early enough that I assumed it might be a delivery driver or perhaps a neighbor with some kind of emergency. Instead, I found a man in a suit holding a manila envelope and asking to confirm my identity. He was a process server, and the envelope contained legal documents that would change everything about my relationship with my family forever. As I stood in my doorway, still in my work clothes, and holding my coffee mug, this stranger handed me papers informing me that my own parents had filed a lawsuit against me. I closed the door and sat down at my kitchen table to read through the documents, my hands shaking as I tried to understand what I was seeing. The lawsuit was more bizarre and hurtful than anything I could have imagined. My parents were claiming that I had somehow defrauded the family by purchasing my house without their knowledge or consent. They alleged that I had manipulated them into not providing financial assistance to Marlene for her own home purchase by hiding my true financial situation and misleading them about my intentions. The most shocking allegation was that I had committed elder financial abuse by refusing to use my house as collateral to help secure loans for Marlene's benefit. They claimed that my refusal to let Marlene live with me constituted a form of financial harm to the family unit, and that I had a legal obligation to share my resources with my sister since we were all part of the same family. The lawsuit demanded that I either sell the house and divide the proceeds equally between Marlene and myself, or transfer ownership of the property directly to Marlene as compensation for the years of financial support I had allegedly received from the family. They were also seeking damages for emotional distress and asking the court to order me to pay their legal fees. I read through the entire document 3 times, each reading making the situation feel more surreal and devastating. These were not legal claims based on any real wrongdoing or factual disputes. These were the desperate actions of parents who were so committed to protecting their preferred daughter from the consequences of her choices that they were willing to destroy their relationship with their other daughter in the process. I called in sick to work and spent the day researching lawyers and trying to understand what I was facing. The attorney I eventually hired, Patricia Williams, was a family law specialist who had dealt with similar cases involving financial disputes between relatives. During our first meeting, she explained that while the claims against me were legally frivolous, defending against them would still require time, money, and emotional energy that would take a significant toll on my life. What made the situation even more painful was discovering how coordinated the attack against me had become. While I was dealing with the legal documents, Marlene had begun a social media campaign designed to destroy my reputation in our community. She posted carefully crafted messages on Facebook and Instagram, describing me as a selfish sister who had abandoned her family in their time of need. She shared photos of herself looking sad and desperate, with captions about how some people forget where they came from once they achieve success. The posts were designed to generate sympathy for Marlene while painting me as a villain, and they were effective. People who had known me for years began commenting with messages of support for Marlene and disappointment in my behavior. Neighbors started treating me differently, and I could feel their judgment every time I left my house. The grocery store, the gas station, even my morning coffee shop became places where I felt unwelcome and scrutinized. My parents refused to speak to me directly during this time, communicating only through their attorney. This was perhaps the most hurtful aspect of the entire situation. Even during our worst disagreements, we had always been able to talk to each other. Now they were treating me like a stranger, like someone who had committed such a serious offense that normal family communication was impossible. The isolation was overwhelming. I had always been close to my extended family, but now I wasn't sure who had been influenced by my parents' version of events and who might still be willing to listen to my side of the story. I felt like I was living in a nightmare where everything I had worked for was being twisted into evidence of my selfishness and failure as a daughter and sister. The legal process moved slowly, and the emotional damage was immediate and severe. I was spending thousands of dollars on attorney fees to defend against claims that everyone involved knew were baseless. I was losing relationships with family members and community connections that had taken years to build. Most painfully, I was discovering that the people I had loved and trusted most in the world were willing to destroy me rather than face the uncomfortable truth about the family dynamics that had created this situation. During the months of preparation for trial, my attorney uncovered the extent to which my parents had been planning this lawsuit. They had consulted with multiple lawyers, researched similar cases, and carefully documented every interaction we had about Marlene's housing situation. They had turned our private family conversations into evidence for their legal case recording dates and details of discussions that I had thought were confidential expressions of concern and love. The betrayal was complete and devastating. My parents hadn't just decided to sue me in a moment of anger or desperation. They had calculated and planned this attack over a period of months, building a case against me while still inviting me to family dinners and pretending that everything was normal between us. The day of the trial was one of the most emotionally difficult experiences of my life. Walking into that courtroom and seeing my parents sitting at the plaintiff's table with their attorney felt like stepping into an alternate reality where everything I had believed about my family had been turned upside down. These were the people who had raised me, who had taught me the values of hard work and independence that I had used to build my life, and now they were asking a judge to punish me for living according to those very principles. My attorney had spent weeks preparing me for this moment, explaining the legal strategy and helping me understand what to expect from the proceedings. She had gathered an impressive amount of documentation supporting my case bank records, showing every deposit from my job since I was 15, employment records demonstrating my consistent work history, loan documents, proving that I had financed my education and home purchase entirely on my own, and character references from employers and colleagues who could testify to my integrity and work ethic. The contrast between my preparation and my parents' case became apparent as soon as their attorney began presenting their argument. Their claims were based almost entirely on emotional appeals and family expectations, rather than any legal principles or documented wrongdoing. They argued that I had a moral obligation to share my success with my sister, and that my refusal to do so constituted a form of family abandonment that deserved legal consequences. My parents took the stand and testified about their disappointment in my behavior, describing me as a daughter who had forgotten her family obligations once she achieved financial success. They talked about the values they had tried to instill in me, and how my actions had violated everything they had taught me about family loyalty and mutual support. My mother cried while describing how much pain my selfishness had caused the family, and my father spoke about his shame at having raised a daughter who would abandon her sister in a time of need. It was excruciating to listen to them describe me as if I were a stranger, as if the 28 years of my life had been nothing but a preparation for this ultimate betrayal of family values. They painted a picture of someone I didn't recognize, someone cruel and calculating who had deliberately withheld help from a struggling family member out of pure selfishness. Marlene's testimony was even more difficult to endure. She had clearly prepared extensively for this moment, presenting herself as a victim of circumstances beyond her control who had been abandoned by the one person who could have helped her. She talked about her job search struggles, her financial stress, and her feelings of rejection when I refused to let her live in my house. She described watching me succeed while she failed, and how painful it was to see the opportunities I had been given while she struggled without support. Her performance was emotionally manipulative and factually misleading, but it was also effective. She managed to present herself as a sympathetic figure while avoiding any mention of the choices she had made that led to her current situation. There was no discussion of the jobs she had quit, the opportunities she had wasted, or the financial support she had already received from our parents over the years. When it was my turn to testify, I felt the weight of having to defend not just my legal position, but my entire life philosophy and value system. My attorney guided me through a detailed account of my work history, starting with that first job at Martha's Diner when I was 15 years old. I described the 3 jobs I had worked simultaneously to pay for college, the student loans I had taken out and paid back, and the careful financial planning that had made my home purchase possible. I presented documentation for every major financial decision I had made as an adult, showing the court that I had achieved everything through my own efforts without any significant help from my family. I explained how I had offered to help Marlene in other ways, such as reviewing her resume and practicing interview skills, but that I had set reasonable boundaries around what type of help I was willing and able to provide. The most important part of my testimony was explaining why those boundaries were necessary. I talked about the pattern of financial dependence that had developed with Marlene, how my parents' willingness to continuously bail her out had prevented her from developing the skills and motivation necessary to support herself. I explained that allowing her to live in my house would have been enabling this pattern rather than helping her become independent. My character witnesses provided powerful testimony about my work ethic and integrity. My current supervisor described my dedication to my job and my reputation as someone who could be counted on to meet her commitments. A former professor talked about how I had managed to excel academically while working multiple jobs to pay for my education. Friends and colleagues described me as someone who was always willing to help others, but who also understood the importance of maintaining healthy boundaries in relationships. The cross-examination by my parents' attorney was aggressive and designed to make me appear selfish and uncaring. He asked detailed questions about my income, my savings, and my expenses, trying to demonstrate that I could afford to help Marlene more than I had. He questioned my motives for buying such a large house when I lived alone, suggesting that it was an unnecessary display of wealth rather than a reasonable housing choice. I answered every question honestly and calmly, sticking to the facts and refusing to be drawn into emotional arguments. When he asked why I couldn't let my sister live with me temporarily, I explained that temporary arrangements in family situations rarely remain temporary, and that I had good reasons to believe that Marlene would not be motivated to find her own housing if she had a comfortable alternative available. The judge's questions during the proceedings made it clear that he was skeptical of my parents' claims from the beginning. He asked pointed questions about the legal basis for their lawsuit, requesting specific citations of laws or precedents that would support their position. When their attorney couldn't provide satisfactory answers, the judge's expression made it obvious that he considered the case to be a waste of the court's time. After hearing all the testimony and reviewing the evidence, the judge dismissed all claims against me with prejudice, meaning that my parents could not refile the same lawsuit in the future. In his ruling, he stated that the case appeared to be based on family disagreements rather than legal issues, and that the court system was not the appropriate venue for resolving disputes about moral obligations between family members. The immediate aftermath of the verdict was a mixture of relief and continued sadness. I had won the legal battle decisively, but the cost had been enormous. I had spent over $15,000 in attorney fees, countless hours of stress and preparation, and most importantly, I had lost the relationship with my parents and sister that had once been one of the most important parts of my life. As we left the courthouse, my parents and Marlene refused to make eye contact with me. They walked away without a word, leaving me standing on the courthouse steps with my attorney, feeling victorious, but also profoundly alone. The legal system had vindicated my position, but it couldn't repair the emotional damage that had been done to our family relationships. Winning the lawsuit was just the beginning of my journey toward rebuilding my life and relationships. The months of legal battle had taken a serious toll on my emotional and physical health, and I knew that I needed to take proactive steps to recover from the trauma of being betrayed by my own family. More importantly, I realized that I needed to send a clear message that there would be consequences for the way I had been treated. After consulting with my attorney, I decided to file a countersuit against my parents for harassment, defamation, and the financial damages I had incurred defending against their frivolous lawsuit. This wasn't a decision I made lightly or out of spite. It was a strategic choice designed to protect myself from future harassment and to establish clear boundaries about what behavior I would and would not tolerate from family members. The defamation claim was based on the false statements Marlene had made about me on social media and the lies my parents had spread to other family members and community members about my character and actions. My attorney was able to document specific instances where these statements had damaged my reputation and caused me emotional distress. We gathered screenshots of social media posts, testimony from people who had heard the false statements, and evidence of how these lies had affected my relationships and standing in the community. The harassment claim focused on the pattern of behavior that had led up to the lawsuit, including the constant pressure to let Marlene live in my house, the threats to exclude me from family events, and the coordinated campaign to manipulate me into giving up my independence. We documented phone calls, text messages, and witness accounts of conversations where my parents had used emotional manipulation and threats to try to force me into compliance with their demands. The financial damages were straightforward to calculate. I had spent over $15,000 in attorney fees defending against their lawsuit, taken time off work for depositions and court appearances, and incurred other costs related to the legal proceedings. These were direct, quantifiable damages that resulted from their decision to file a baseless lawsuit against me. When my parents received the countersuit documents, their reaction was immediate and panicked. Within days of being served, their attorney contacted my attorney to discuss the possibility of settling the case out of court. The confident attitude they had displayed during their own lawsuit disappeared completely when they realized they might face serious financial and legal consequences for their actions. The settlement negotiations revealed just how much my parents regretted their decision to sue me. Their attorney acknowledged that their original lawsuit had been ill-advised and that they were willing to do whatever was necessary to resolve the situation and avoid going to trial on my countersuit. They were particularly concerned about the defamation claims, which could have resulted in significant financial damages if we had been able to prove that their false statements had caused measurable harm to my reputation or career. My terms for settlement were non-negotiable and designed to prevent any future harassment, while also providing some measure of justice for what I had endured. First, I required a written public apology that would be posted on the same social media platforms where the false statements had been made. The apology had to acknowledge that their claims against me had been baseless, that I had achieved my success through my own hard work, and that they regretted the pain and damage their actions had caused. Second, they had to reimburse me for all of my legal fees and related expenses, which totaled over $18,000 by the time the countersuit was filed. This wasn't just about getting my money back. It was about making sure they understood that there were real financial consequences for their behavior. Third, and most importantly, they had to sign a legally binding agreement that they would cease all harassment, refrain from making any further false statements about me, and respect my boundaries regarding contact and communication. The agreement specified that any violation of these terms would result in automatic financial penalties and could be used as evidence in future legal proceedings. The community's reaction to the settlement was swift and decisive. When the public apology was posted, many people who had initially supported Marlene based on her false social media posts began to understand what had really happened. Neighbors who had been treating me coldly started approaching me with apologies and expressions of support. The narrative changed from me being a selfish daughter to being a hard-working young woman who had been unfairly attacked by her own family. Marlene was forced to face the consequences of her lies and manipulation for the first time in her life. Several of her friends and supporters distanced themselves from her when they learned the truth about the situation. Her social media following, which had grown during her campaign against me, began to decline as people realized they had been manipulated into supporting a false narrative. My parents experienced their own form of social consequences. Other family members who had initially supported their position began to question their judgment and express concern about their treatment of me. The family dynamics that had enabled Marlene's behavior for years were finally being challenged by people outside our immediate family circle. The most satisfying aspect of the settlement was watching my parents confront the reality of their financial situation without being able to rely on me as a safety net. They had spent thousands of dollars on their own attorney fees, were now responsible for reimbursing my legal expenses, and still had to figure out how to deal with Marlene's ongoing housing and employment problems. For the first time, they were facing the full cost of their enabling behavior without being able to pass that cost on to me. Marlene's reaction to the settlement was predictably dramatic. She initially refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing and continued to maintain that she had been the victim in the situation. However, when it became clear that her legal options were exhausted and that continuing to make false statements about me would result in additional legal consequences, she gradually began to retreat from her public campaign against me. The legal victory gave me something I hadn't realized I needed: validation that my position had been reasonable and that my family's behavior had been unacceptable. For months, I had been second-guessing myself, wondering if I really was being selfish or if I should have handled the situation differently. The court's decision and the settlement terms confirmed that I had been right to set boundaries and defend myself against their unreasonable demands. The year following the legal settlement was a period of intense personal growth and healing. The trauma of being betrayed and attacked by my own family had left deep emotional wounds that couldn't be healed simply by winning a court case. I knew that I needed professional help to process what had happened and to develop healthy strategies for moving forward with my life. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in family trauma and boundary issues. Through our sessions, I began to understand the long-term patterns of dysfunction that had existed in my family for years, patterns that I had been too close to recognize while I was living within them. The lawsuit hadn't been an isolated incident of bad judgment. It had been the inevitable result of years of enabling behavior favoritism and emotional manipulation that had corrupted the basic foundations of our family relationships. My therapist helped me understand that my parents' inability to accept my success wasn't really about me at all. It was about their own feelings of failure and inadequacy as parents. Marlene's struggles reflected poorly on their parenting choices, while my success highlighted the effectiveness of the independence and work ethic they had taught me, but hadn't reinforced with her. Rather than acknowledging this disparity and working to address Marlene's underlying problems, they had chosen to tear down my achievements in an attempt to level the playing field. This understanding was both liberating and deeply sad. It freed me from the guilt and self-doubt that had plagued me throughout the legal battle, but it also meant accepting that my parents might never be capable of having a healthy relationship with me. Their need to protect Marlene from the consequences of her choices was stronger than their ability to appreciate and support my accomplishments. The therapy process also helped me recognize the importance of building chosen family relationships with people who could appreciate and support my goals and values. I had always been somewhat introverted, focusing more on work and personal achievements than on building a wide social network. But the isolation I had experienced during the family crisis made me realize how important it was to have relationships with people who knew and valued the real me. I began investing more time and energy in friendships with colleagues, neighbors, and people I met through various activities and interests. These relationships were based on mutual respect and shared values rather than obligation or family history. For the first time in my life, I experienced what it felt like to be surrounded by people who celebrated my successes rather than resenting them. My career continued to flourish during this period of personal growth. The confidence I had gained from successfully defending myself against my family's attacks translated into greater assertiveness and leadership skills at work. I was promoted to senior marketing manager, which came with a significant salary increase and additional responsibilities that I found both challenging and rewarding. The financial benefits of the promotion allowed me to make some improvements to my house that I had been planning since I first moved in. I renovated the master bathroom, updated the landscaping in the backyard, and converted the basement into a home office where I could work on freelance projects. Each improvement made the house feel more completely mine, reinforcing the sense of independence and stability that had motivated me to buy it in the first place. I also began dating more seriously during this time. The emotional growth I had experienced through therapy had made me more confident about my worth and more selective about the type of relationship I wanted. I met someone through a friend who worked in a different industry, but shared many of my values about work independence and personal responsibility. Our relationship developed slowly and naturally, built on mutual respect and genuine compatibility, rather than neediness or convenience. The contrast between this healthy relationship and the toxic dynamics I had experienced with my family was stark and educational. In a healthy relationship, success was celebrated rather than resented, boundaries were respected rather than challenged, and conflicts were resolved through honest communication rather than manipulation and legal threats. My contact with my parents during this period was minimal and strictly controlled. They had honored the terms of our settlement agreement, refraining from harassment and making no further false statements about me. However, they had also made no genuine effort to repair our relationship or to acknowledge the deeper issues that had led to the crisis. Our interactions were limited to brief, polite exchanges at unavoidable family events, and even those were strained and superficial. Marlene's situation had not improved significantly despite being freed from the consequences of her campaign against me. She continued to struggle with employment, moving from job to job and apartment to apartment, without ever developing the stability or work ethic necessary for long-term success. My parents continued to support her financially, but their resources were more limited now due to the costs they had incurred during the legal battle. The extended family gradually developed a more complete understanding of what had really happened between us. Several relatives reached out to me privately to express their regret for initially supporting my parents' position and to acknowledge that they hadn't understood the full situation. These conversations were healing and helped me rebuild some of the family connections that had been damaged during the crisis. However, I also learned to accept that some relationships had been permanently damaged and that this was not my responsibility to fix. People who had been quick to judge me based on incomplete information, or who continued to believe that I should have sacrificed my independence for Marlene's benefit, were not people I needed or wanted in my life. The most important lesson I learned during this healing period was the difference between guilt and regret. I felt no guilt about my decisions or actions throughout the entire situation. I had behaved ethically, legally, and reasonably at every step. However, I did feel genuine regret about the loss of what I had hoped could be loving, supportive relationships with my parents and sister. That regret was healthy and appropriate, but it didn't require me to change my behavior or compromise my boundaries in order to make them feel better about their choices. This distinction helped me maintain my emotional health while still acknowledging the sadness of the situation. I could mourn the loss of the family relationships I had wanted without taking responsibility for the dysfunction that had made those relationships impossible. As I approached my 30th birthday, I felt more confident and settled than I had ever been in my life. I had a career I enjoyed, a home I loved, relationships with people who valued and supported me, and most importantly, a clear understanding of my own worth and boundaries. The crisis with my family had been painful, but it had also been transformative in ways that I was only beginning to fully appreciate. The legal battle had forced me to articulate and defend my values in a way that I had never had to do before. It had shown me that I was capable of standing up for myself even when it meant facing opposition from the people I loved most. And it had taught me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to refuse to enable their destructive behavior even when they can't understand or appreciate that choice. So let me ask you this: have you ever had to choose between keeping peace in your family and standing up for what you knew was right? How did you handle a situation where the people who were supposed to support you the most were actually trying to tear you down? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like, and consider subscribing for more real-life stories about overcoming family drama and building the life you deserve. And please share this video with anyone who might be struggling with similar boundary issues in their own family relationships. Thank you so much for listening to my story and for all your support. Remember that you have the right to be proud of your achievements, regardless of how others might react to your success. Sometimes the family you choose is more important than the family you're born into, and there's nothing wrong with prioritizing your own well-being and growth. I hope my experience can help someone else who might be facing similar challenges. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next video.